So this is a lecture on whole muscle anatomy and physiology. And as we know, we're talking about the all-in-one contraction of a single muscle cell, and many, many muscle cells are going to make up a whole muscle. The whole idea is that you want to control and regulate it a little on a finer scale because you want to have some variability as far as how much force that muscle is going to exert on the load that it is trying to move. So we have two different types of contractions. An isometric contraction where there's no shortening of the skeletal muscle because the muscle tension increases, but it does not exceed the load. Let me give you an example. I may want to move an entire wall in my house. And so I could try to do that. And if I put my hands on the wall and I try to push the wall, you could feel your muscle tensing, but it's not going to contract. It's because there's no way that I can move that wall. It's no way. So if the load that I'm trying to move is way too big and way overwhelming, I can try and I will develop muscle tension, but there's no way I'm going to move the actual wall. So when you do that or you put your hands together and try to move them, you can feel the muscle tension, but you're not moving the load. And that means no shortening. You do get muscle tension, but you're not going to move the wall. On the other hand, I could pick up a book. Hey, I can pick up a book. That's isotonic contraction. Your muscle does shorten because the muscle tension is greater than the load. The weight of the book is less than my ability to contract and generate tension and force. And my isotonic contraction can move the book. My isometric contraction cannot move the wall. So the other part that we'll briefly get into is force and duration of contraction can vary in response to stimuli of different frequencies and different intensities. You want to be able to have a muscle respond in sort of a gradient way from, let's say, small, medium to large, depending on the load that you want to move. So you can increase the frequency of the firing, or you can increase the intensity generated, and in both cases, that is going to be something that is going to be like almost like a summation. It's going to be due to stimulation, either a very low stimulation or high stimulation, or it could be that the frequency of stimulation is going to increase because you want to have some control over the variability of the response of an entire muscle. And this is just showing you a diagram of a isometric contraction. So obviously 6 kilograms is a little bit too much for this muscle. So you can see an increase in tension, but you're not going to be able to move the load. Whereas in an isotonic contraction, instead of 6, you've got 3 kilograms, and obviously the muscle is not going to have a problem with shortening, and that's going to move the load. That's the difference between the two of them. Now, when we get back to how are you going to control increase in frequency, increase in intensity to generate different strengths, we get into the whole concept of the motor unit. So let me read it to you and then explain. Each muscle is served by at least one motor nerve that branches. Most muscles are served by many, many, many motor nerves that branch. A motor unit is a motor neuron and all 4 to several hundred muscle fiber cells it supplies. So a picture is worth 1,000 words. Give me the picture. Come on. There we go. So here is a red motor neuron and a blue motor neuron, and they branch at the end. And motor neuron 1 is going to have nerve endings on muscle cell. Let's say this is, let's go from the top to the bottom. This would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So in the blue one is going to innervate muscle cell 3 and then muscle cell 9. If it is stimulated to fire, with my motor unit 2, it has 3 branches, one on muscle cell 1, muscle cell 5, and muscle cell 7. So if the blue motor neuron fires all by itself, then this muscle cell and this muscle cell will contract. So muscle cell 3 and muscle cell 9 will contract and give you a slight shortening of the entire muscle. If muscle cell 2 fires only, then you're going to have 3 muscle cells in the muscle contract. You're going to have 1, 5, and 7. Okay, so if motor neuron or unit 2 fires, 3 of those muscle cells are going to contract. Now here comes the important part. If I have motor neuron or motor unit 1 and motor unit or neuron 2 fire at the same time, you now are going to have 5 of those muscle cells fire at the same time, and they do all or none contraction, and you would get more force generated if those 2 fire at the same time than if one fired at a time. And that's perhaps a very confusing example of it. But if you want to have kind of like a small, medium, large type of response for muscle contraction, because it's composed of so many hundreds and thousands of muscle cells, that's how you do it. So the motor neurons, or motor units, because that's, you call them units because they will innervate more than one motor cell. Sorry about this. I somehow managed to get these advancing incorrectly. Then if only 1 fired, you get a small muscle contraction. If 2 fired at the same time, you're going to increase that contraction of the muscle. If you had 10 fire at the same time, that would give you 10 times more contraction, and so forth and so on. Now, we like to reduce things, right? We want to reduce contraction to the smallest unit, like the sarcomere. What if you want to have the whole muscle contract minimally? That's called a muscle twitch. So it's a motor unit responds to a single action potential, or a single, you see, that's next time. So we're going to, instead of talking about action potential, a single electrical stimulation of its motor neuron. Or you can think about a muscle twitch being the simplest contraction of that muscle that we can observe. So a muscle twitch is kind of equivalent to the sarcomere. It's the smallest unit of contraction of a muscle, and a sarcomere is the smallest unit of contraction of a muscle cell. And when you're talking about a muscle twitch of a whole muscle, there seems to be 3 stages. The latent stage is the events of, in other words, when it says events of excitation, contraction, coupling, no muscle tension, what they're talking about is, look, in order for that muscle to contract, you're going to have to contract certain of the muscle cells. They're going to have to be electrically stimulated. The stimulation has to go down to tubules to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. You have to release calcium, which binds, you got the general idea. all of that leading up to the contraction is what's happening in the latent events. Seems like nothing's happening, but lots of things are happening. It's just the muscle are not shortening yet. Then you get the ta-da period of contraction. Actin and myosin interact with each other, and they form that sliding model of skeletal muscle contraction. And that's the period of contraction when all the muscle cells that you're going to involve in that contraction contract. Then you got to relax that little sucker, right? So the period of relaxation is when you've got the calcium going back to the SR and the actin goes back to its original relaxed, lengthened state. So, and the fact that the muscle contracts faster than it relaxes is just something I'm never going to test you on, but there's so many steps, as you well know, to muscle cell contraction that's the reason why it's longer. And it also means that since it's in milliseconds, that actually works to your advantage as far as your perception that muscle contraction is continuous. Otherwise, you'd be dropping a lot of things along the way, I suppose. Okay, so this is a lovely figure showing this as a graph. So it shows that when you electrically stimulate a muscle and get the smallest contraction of that muscle, which is called a muscle twitch, there is a period where it seems nothing is going on, latent, and then the muscle actually, actin and myosin interact, and they get that sliding. That's the contraction. And then, of course, the electrical stimulation stops, and the muscle relaxes as the actin goes back to its lengthened state. Okay, so that's the anatomy of a muscle twitch. Okay, can we get graded responses from small, medium to large? Of course you can. Some of it is going to be due to changing frequency of stimulation and changing strength of stimulation. I'm going to go into it very superficially. I'm going to do the changing of the frequency of stimulation first, and then talking about how can you change the strength, have it be more intense. So let's do frequency first. All right, if I can get to the next slide. Come on. All right. If you increase frequency enough, you can get the maximal contraction or muscle tension of that muscle, and it's called fused or complete tetanus or tetany. That can happen for a while, and then you're going to run out of ATP, and the muscle is going to fatigue and relax. So in the next slide, you have a graph that is showing this. And I'm taking the extreme because if you want that muscle to get to maximal contraction, shortening, and all you do is increase the frequency of the stimuli to such an extent that the entire muscle is going to maximally contract. That's called tetanus. And then it's going to fatigue and go back to its lengthened, shortened, relaxed state. So, if the stimuli isn't quite as pronounced as this, you can get gradations, and the muscle can contract either a little, mid, a lot, depending on the frequency. Slow down the frequency, then the muscle will contract less forcefully. The other situation is going to be increase your stimulus strength, and that can be due to having a lot of motor neurons fire at the same time. And depending on how many are firing at the same time, you can go from low stimulus strength, medium stimulus strength, maximum stimulus strength. And what you are trying to do is something called recruitment. You're trying to recruit more of the muscle cells in that muscle contraction. Sometimes it's called summation instead of recruitment. Either way, what you're doing is you're either summing the strengths together from low, medium, high, or recruiting muscle cells to contract at the same time. It's similar meanings. Very often you have a sub-threshold stimuli where you just are not applying enough electrical stimulation to get any contraction. And then if you reach a certain stimulus strength, then bingo, that is threshold, and threshold means now you're going to get a response. You're going to get a contraction. The contraction might be very small, but if it's max stimulus, then it means that all the motor neurons are firing at the same time, and that increase in stimulus strength will give you maximal contraction. So let's look at some examples of that. Now this may be a confusing set of figures and graphs. So I call these kitchen sink, that they're trying to accomplish an awful lot, and in one way good and another way confusing. So I'm going to take them from top, medium to bottom. So this is showing you stimulus strength. What stimulus strength means is that over here maybe only a few of the motor neurons, motor neurons fire at the same time. Here you have maybe half of them, and over here you have 100% right over here. This is showing you the proportion of the motor neurons / motor units that are being fired and exciting the motor skeletal muscle cells. So here you have all these muscle cells in a muscle. Here we go, look at them. And then if only 2 fire, then that stimulus strength is pretty low. And then over here you have maybe, I don't know, 80% of them, and they fire at the same time, and you get kind of this medium contraction. And over here 100% of them are firing all at the same time, and my God, you got max contraction. And this is just showing the strength of muscle contraction. You fire a couple of them at the same time, you get some strength, not much. I can pick up a book. Now if I have a 5-pound weight, I better fire a lot more, and that is going to give me a stronger response. And then, last but not least, I want to pick up a 10-pound barbell, and I'm going to need all of them to fire at the same time to get maximal shortening, maximal contraction. There we go. The other way that you can do it, you can get more strength if the muscle cells are larger. Motor units with the smallest muscle fibers or cells are recruited first. Then second are going to be motor units that are fatter. Now, what I mean by fatter, you can, through training exercise, get muscle cells that are going to expand their actin and myosin. So maybe now they have 50% more actin and myosin than the smallest. The largest motor neurons or units are going to be innervating those cells that maybe have 100 times more actin and myosin than the smallest. So their force of contraction is going to be greater. So it's almost like Goldilocks. This is, it's too cold, it's too hot, this is just right, or small, medium, and large. Forget about Goldilocks, that's a lousy example. Small, medium, and large. Because the way that the person trained, you can actually train in such a way that you can have more force, or you can have more endurance, and it depends on how much actin and myosin are actually in that muscle cell that are contributing to the force of contraction. And this is showing you kind of a diagram. So here's the small, here's the medium. These are all that's one muscle cell, that's another muscle cell, that's a third muscle cell. But the way that the person trained is they perhaps only have a few of these, and maybe they have, I don't know, 30% of these that have 10% or 10% more actinomyosin. Now, when you get over here, this is one very large muscle cell that has maybe expanded its actinomyosin 100 times, or 100%. So if you want to recruit your larger muscle cells, then you are going to apply a higher electrical stimulation. So over here, you don't have to apply much electrical stimulation, maybe a small electrical stimulation to have all the very, very small motor um, more of the small muscle cells to contract. But if you want to involve these medium size, you're going to have to up your amperage. You're going to have your millivolt go up. So you're going to have a stronger stimulus, and that will recruit this population and this population. So that's how you get more. Now, if you want max, you're going to have to stimulate further. You're going to have to increase the strength of stimulus so that you recruit this population and this population and this population. And that's how you can get maximal contraction, by increasing stimulus strength. So it's called recruitment. It's also called summation. I don't know if this is a really clear diagram of that, but it's almost like you sum this and you add that and you add that, and that gives you max. So recruitment or summation really mean the same thing. If you want that muscle to suddenly, bam, contract maximally, then you're going to have to apply a strong stimulus strength. But by recruitment, by summation, you can do it. Next on the hip parade, let's talk about muscle metabolism and how do you get all this energy for contraction. So what happens is you need to generate a lot of ATP within the muscle cells, and because that is what is needed for contraction. The ATP is needed for the calcium pump. The ATP is needed for the actin and myosin to interact with each other. The fact that the power stroke is going to be needing ATP energy. So when your muscles contract, they are using up a lot of ATP energy, using up a lot of calories. And skeletal muscle cells especially are going to perhaps be in a situation where you need to use them maximally. So there's an additional energy source, a backup energy source, like a backup generator. So let's just talk about that. ATP is the only source of energy used directly for contraction of either a muscle or a muscle cell. The movement, detachment of myosin, making cross bridges, calcium pumps, etc. all need ATP energy. ATP can be generated directly, right? Aerobic cell respiration, but since ATP is so necessary for skeletal muscle contractions, the cells have a second energy source. And I do want you to know this for one of the questions on the Moodle quiz. Creatine phosphate. So ATP is adenosine triphosphate and CP is creatine phosphate. It's a backup. Other cells in the body don't need it, don't have it. Skeletal muscle cells absolutely need it. Creatine phosphate. We want to move our body, you need a backup, creatine phosphate. So when ATP levels are low in the cell, there can be a transfer of energy from creatine phosphate to ADP to form more adenosine triphosphate, energy currency, making it possible for muscles to contract for a longer period of time. So that's unique to muscles. Concluding slide. There are so many additional details on muscle cell types, exercise physiology, which is fascinating, etc. But I'm not going to cover it, so it's not going to be on the Moodle quiz or the departmental exam. If you're interested in exercise physiology, there are fantastic books on that. It goes into the different types of exercise for power, for endurance. That's fascinating, but it's not going to be on the Moodle quiz. I'm not going to cover it, and it will not be on the departmental exam. But certainly, if you want more info, these are chapters in any anatomy and physiology book, or to get a paperback on exercise physiology, and have fun with that, but that is not necessary for this section and this week on muscle. So I will see you soon for the nervous system in week 5.